Welcome to Ideas in Action, a television series about ideas and their consequences. I'm Jim Glassman. This week, we continue our conversation on the rise of China as an economic and military power. Many people are saying the 21st century will be known as China's, much as the 20th was called the American century. How seriously should Americans view China's ascendance as an economic and military power? And what policies should the United States government pursue to ensure America remains competitive? Joining me to explore this topic, George Gilder, founding fellow of the Discovery Institute; Charles Freeman, China scholar at the Center for Strategic and International Studies; and Gordon Chang, author of The Coming Collapse of China. The topic this week, China and the U.S. Forecasts for the Future, Part 2. This is Ideas in Action.
Funding for Ideas in Action is provided by Investors Business Daily. Every stock market cycle is led by America's never-ending stream of innovative new companies and inventions. Investors Business Daily helps investors find these new leaders as they emerge. More information is available at investors.com.
As the U.S. and Europe grapple with slow economic growth, China's economic clout is growing. China already has the world's third largest economy, and last year became the world's leading exporter. This dramatic rise in the country's fortunes has led to a newfound confidence among the Chinese. But internally, China faces troublesome demographic trends: more men than women, an aging population, and disputes over resources and land, all of which could affect China's economic strength in the future. Gordon Chang, you have written a book that talks about the coming collapse of China, economically, that is. Why do you believe that?
And politically as well. China prospered in the unusually benign post-Cold War period of seemingly never-ending globalization. But since the middle of 2008, we're in a very different global environment. China's export model, which is really what their economy is about, is just particularly ill-suited for current global conditions. As we saw in the Great Depression, it was the current account surplus countries that had the hardest time adjusting to deteriorating conditions and therefore suffered the most, and that's China. They're having a very difficult time thinking about how to reorganize and restructure their economy. They always talk about, a consumer model, but consumption in China as a percentage of the economy has been sliding from about 60% to about 30% today, and no country has a lower rate. And all the government is trying to do with its stimulus program over the last year or so has really been to decrease the role of consumption in China. So essentially what we have got is a country that doesn't have a political model or an economic model that is suited for current times.
Charles, do you agree with that?
No, I think that the Chinese model, while it has many flaws, is not likely to lead to its collapse economically or politically anytime soon. I mean, this is a country which has shown itself remarkably self-sustaining, and I think it's going to continue. Yes, I agree that there are some fundamental flaws with the economic structure, and that has to change and will require some deep sacrifices by a lot of people. And I think politically as well, there are any number of challenges within the Chinese Communist Party to look at their long-term hold on power. But one of the interesting things is that the Chinese government has been extremely smart about looking down the road and figuring out, well, what are the challenges, what are the internal challenges that we face to our continued hold on power, and they've made some adjustments. There have been some actually very interesting work. There has been some very interesting work on internal Chinese democracy, and they've studied long-term one-party democracies like Japan, at least used to be, and Mexico, at least used to be. So that they are sort of planning for a shift. If nothing else, this is a country which is moving some 600 million people out of rural China into the cities. The process of urbanization alone is going to drive economic development for many years to come.
But George seems to disagree with something that was said. I think you were shaking your head here.
I really agree with all of that. I think that
you agree with what Charles said.
Yeah. But, I think I don't think China is going to collapse. I think that supply creates its own demand, that China is becoming increasingly sophisticated in the panoply of products that it produces. It's now...
But what about this point about consumers? I mean, you know, China has an export economy. Consumers are really not big players in China. And isn't that going to be a problem in a world in which, whether we like it or not, it seems that countries are kind of pulling in their horns when it comes to trade?
I think it's a myth. I think that producing ever more varied, ingenious, valuable, cheap products for the world is permanently workable strategy, and that's essentially the strategy they've adopted.
Are there things that China is doing that that we can learn from in the United States? I mean, successes that China is having economically are the result of policies that maybe we ought to adopt. What might some of those policies be?
Well, it's an awful lot easier to start a business and get it going in China than it is here. It's an awful lot easier to employ people and begin to create wealth there than here. And we've sort of forgotten over the past 30 years that that sometimes risk is a good thing.
You know, that's really, I think, would probably come as a shock to many of our viewers, that it's easier to start a business in China than it is in the United States. You know, this is a communist country. You know, you don't have to go to the party and get something signed.
Oh, you do. There are challenges. I mean, you have to. The banking system is difficult, and getting the chops is difficult. But by and large, you want to start a business, you want to get your office fitted up, you want to build something, you want to build a factory. It's pretty easy to do. Unlike here, the permitting process alone will drive you crazy, and then you go through the process of, as George says, you know, going into the pension system and all the rest. It's a lot easier to do it in China. There's a sense that risk is a good thing, that taking risks is a good thing. Here, I think there are too many unacceptable risks, and that's a challenge.
And to be rich is glorious.
To be rich is glorious.
and what about education? I mean, is China turning out a workforce that is becoming better and better educated compared to the United States and Europe?
Well, China's education system has improved over the 30 years of the reform era, but nonetheless, there are certain built-in limitations that China cannot progress forward, largely because you got a political system that really is stultifying. You know, when you have Marxist education in not only primary schools but all the way through universities, that tends to sort of put a damper on things. And
we had that here.
And I'm not talking just...
we have Marxist education from the schools all through the universities in the United States. So what else is new?
Not mandated by the government, not all the time. I think the real problem is it's not only in politics, you know, economics, other subjects that are considered to be sensitive, but also in the sciences. Because, you know, the Chinese government does have these theories about the origins of the Chinese people. So if you want to talk about demography or if you want to talk about biology, even hard sciences are affected by the political control in China. So, you know, I think that education is a really serious constraint for the Chinese because of the quality of the system. I mean, if it weren't, you wouldn't have all these Chinese going around the world to the United States, Europe, elsewhere, and continuing a brain drain in China.
But then, but they do go back home, and they're certainly, whatever they learned in the United States is helping people back home.
Some of them go home, but most of them stay, and that's still the truth.
If we let them stay, this is one of the further insanities of American policy, is we educate Chinese here and then force them to return home. And ultimately, the success of the U.S. economy has always been dependent on immigration. We've got to accept quality immigrants in order to succeed as a country. Our current educational system will not cut it all through the secondary level. We've got to have world champion workers in the United States. And today, we are ejecting them. And it's absolutely perverse, and it, again, puts us on a decline relative to China.
What do you think, George, the United States can learn from China as far as other kinds of policies, as far as, I don't know, fiscal policies or just general economic policies?
I think the Chinese are building 30 to 60 nuclear plants. They're using coal, which is a very good power source. They're drilling for oil. They aren't banning oil drilling. They don't imagine that suppressing existing energy contributes in any way whatsoever to producing profitable new energy or alternative energy.
By the way, the Chinese are also buying up resources, energy resources in other countries. Is that do you think that's a good idea for China to be doing? And is that a threat in any way to the United States?
I think there's ample resources and that we should be exploring and exploiting our potential resources, which are essentially unlimited in the energy field.
I think the Chinese government, I think, has a false sense of how global commodity markets work,
right.
And they believe that they can capture upstream production. But George is absolutely right. Any new addition to the global commodity markets, whether it's from Sudan or Iran or other unmentionables, frankly, is good for the United States.
You know, some people say that while the United States is putting huge amounts of resources into taking care of the elderly through Social Security, Medicare, and so forth, the Chinese are concentrating more on young people, and that is much healthier for their economy. And that brings up another issue that has to do with China, which is limiting the number of children that a family can have. I mean, ultimately, isn't this going to hurt the Chinese, the one child per family policy?
Well, it certainly will, because within 5 years, the Chinese workforce will level off. Within 15 to 20 years, the entire population will level off. By 2030, maybe by 2025, India, not China, will be the world's most populous nation. They'll have a demographic scale which will be very, very disadvantageous. I don't know how they're going to support any aged people at all, given the way that the Chinese population is aging. So essentially, you've got funny demographics. You know, in China, you basically have 118 males, 123 males to every 100 females. You can't maintain a society like that, and essentially, isn't it likely that those rules will change? I think Chinese demographers, if you talk to them privately, will tell you that the government's policies are really counterproductive. But for various institutional reasons, I think it's very difficult for the Communist Party to give up the one-child rule, largely because that's a measure of control that the party exercises, especially in rural areas where the party is already having trouble maintaining institutional loyalty. So although I think almost everybody in Chinese society will think that the one-child policy is not good for society, I think it's going to take them a very long time to change it. And by the time that they do, it'll be too late. Do you agree with that, Charles? Right? I mean, is that the Achilles heel?
Well, they've started to relax the one-child policy already, recognizing that where the demographic shifts are taking them. But it's pretty interesting. I mean, the great beauty of the lack of Chinese democracy, there is no AARP in China that sort of funnels wealth to the elderly, so they can focus more on younger people and promoting younger people.
And the Chinese, what is the Chinese system for helping older people? There's nothing like Social Security or Medicare in China.
The iron rice bowl that used to preserve the sort of give older people pensions and housing and the rest of it collapsed years ago, and it's a huge challenge for China to figure out what they can do. It used to be in Chinese society, older people, parents would move in with children and grandchildren, and that has collapsed largely as a result of the one-child policy. There are too many older people to go around. They're looking at models of senior housing and the rest of it, but that hasn't really taken off in any form yet.
George, a lot of people in the United States, especially politicians, talk about competing with China. The Chinese are going to get an edge in competing with us. You don't seem to buy that model. Do you think that's the right way to think about it?
I think that these two economies are intimately intertwined. And so capitalism is mainly a system of collaboration. That's what capitalists do. Capitalists want their markets to expand. They want other people to succeed. And so I think that China's success is American success, and America's success will help China.
Do you think the Chinese understand that? I mean, did they look at it as well, we're gonna beat those Americans?
I think they will learn as their capitalist system evolves. I think we're forgetting it, and that's the tragedy.
Gordon?
Well, I think that they will learn it, but the problem is they'll probably learn it too late. I mean, they still have a zero-sum view of trade. And I think essentially what you're seeing is right now, the American and the Chinese economies are actually delinking. And that probably will continue if the global economy doesn't pick up. And so we're dealing with a very different environment than we did after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Delinking in the sense that there is less trade?
There's less trade. 2009, China's exports to the U.S. declined by 12.5%.
But do you think some of the delinking is because of what George has been saying about the United States having these provocative policies toward China with Taiwan or the Dalai Lama?
It's all economics. You know, essentially, there's an economic model that worked for 2 decades, and now, you know, there's really a revaluation of it because of various things. But I think it's mostly economics that is sort of driving trade down. You know, the global economy is not so robust. Americans are not in a position to be the global engine of recovery for every other nation. And so I think that the Chinese economy is certainly suffering because of that.
But are the Chinese? Let me put it this way: do you think the United States should encourage China to open up more to the United States? Is that a problem?
I think that it would be a great thing for the two economies to be more closely linked, but that's not the way things, in fact, are going.
But is the problem that the Chinese, as many Americans believe, have shut off their markets to us? I know Charles disagrees with that, but is that? Do you think that's a problem?
Yes. I mean, since the middle of 2006, you've seen the Chinese government take a very active stance in preventing takeovers of Chinese enterprises by American and other foreign companies. We've seen the use of the anti-monopoly law, the new law in China, used only against foreigners. We've seen all sorts of export rebates being put into place recently, which are very much beggar thy neighbor policies. The real problem here is that the Chinese government doesn't think that it needs to go through the model that Deng Xiaoping thought would be good for China. And so you do see, especially in the last 2.5, 3 years, a very different attitude and mentality on the part of the Chinese government, and they're moving in the wrong directions.
And you agree with that, Charles?
In part. I think the Chinese have learned well at our feet in terms of taking some of the protectionist moves that they have over the last few years. I mean, Gordon's right. I mean, there have been specific actions to deny American and other foreign investment into Chinese enterprises. In media, but fruit juice and the rest of it.
Oh yeah, the fruit juice.
And heavy industry. But remember, this got started with the United States denying or appearing to deny the Chinese investment in Unical, and continued on with the Chinese with an apparent denial of a Chinese investment in 3Com. So there has been precedent here. The United States has been restrictive in terms of controlling exports of technology to China, and there has been a lot of kind of economic nationalism here and there. Unfortunately, it's driven us apart a little bit. I think by and large, though, at the end of the day, the two economies are so inextricably linked that yes, there has been a reduction of Chinese imports to the United States. That's because we were consuming 70% plus of our GDP. That couldn't go on. 130% of household income was debt in the United States at the high point. That had to change.
George, you have been at the vanguard of new media. Doesn't it bother you a little bit about what the Chinese have been doing with not just Google, but Facebook, some of the aggressive hacking, some people would call it cyber warfare, in fact, that's coming out of China, whether it's from the government or whether from individuals? Certainly it's coming. You know, doesn't that bother you a little bit? Don't you think the United States should be pushing back against that?
I think American companies have to develop technologies that deal with this kind of threat. As it happens, an Akamais study, that's the internet company, shows that there are fewer viruses and scams on the Chinese internet than on the U.S. internet. The U.S. is really the major source of viruses and other attacks. I also don't think that this is mostly a government issue. I think that Google, which is one of the world's leading sources of sophistication in technology, had better figure out how to defend its own email. Harassing China will not solve this problem. The U.S. continuation of our global lead in computer technology is the only answer.
The problem is that China maintains the Great Firewall, one of the most sophisticated series of barriers. And you can't have hacking in China without the government knowing about it. And most of this is probably funded by either the Chinese central government, the Communist Party, or the People's Liberation Army, because no other groups in society have the ability to fund what they've been talking about. And certainly...
What's the attacks?
The attacks. And the cyber attacks against not only Google and other companies, but also foreign governments, civilian networks around the world. It's not just the United States. Unfortunately, the problem is a Chinese government one. And so I think it does require a U.S. government and a German government and a Japanese government solution.
Well, there are two ways to solve a problem like that. Either you mobilize the technological resources to address it, or you attack the source. And if you think...
Or both.
Well, I think that's probably not... Ultimately, we benefit from being attacked in this way. We
benefit from being attacked?
Yes, because it exposes weaknesses and vulnerabilities in our computer systems on which the whole economy relies.
Do you agree with George, Charles, that maybe the Chinese are doing us a favor by attacking us, kind of, not really huge attacks, and so that we fix those, and so we become less vulnerable to worse things in the future?
I get nervous whenever we sort of use the moniker "the Chinese" or China, because China is a pretty chaotic place. I tend to disagree a little bit with Gordon that it's impossible to for individual Chinese hackers or otherwise to work unimpeded. All it takes is a virtual private network, which anybody in China has access to for a nominal fee. It's pretty easy to get through the firewall. It's not as extensive as all that.
Let me just say that I used to be the chairman of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which runs Voice of America and so forth. And I can tell you the Chinese or somebody in China does an incredibly good job of keeping these signals out of China. No, they're very good at it, better than anyone else in the world.
It does require some ingenuity in order to access it, but one can, and there are plenty of ingenious Chinese out there. I should not to shill for Google, but just to make sure that Google actually, its Gmail system was not compromised by the attacks that they discovered.
George's article sort of raises, I think, implicitly the issue of whether the United States should be standing up for values that are important here. They're universal values, but they're certainly important to Americans, including human rights, freedom of expression, and so forth, which are not enjoyed by all the people in China. I mean, how much do you think that the United States should be pushing China on these issues of human rights and freedom in general? Gordon.
I think that we should, to a certain extent. China, when you look at it as a country, it has a political system which is very different from ours. They're not going to listen to us when we talk about human rights and other things. But the Chinese people will, because the Chinese people want the same things that we want. And so therefore, I think that the United States should engage the Chinese people. Human rights dialogues tend to end up being pretty ritualized. But nonetheless, I think that we should continue them. They were very important in our dealings with the Soviet Union and may have even played a crucial role. So I think that they are just one of a number of things that the United States should be doing in connection with our relations with China.
George?
The Soviet Union was not a vital economic ally of the United States. China and Taiwan are absolutely critical partners of the U.S. economic system. And so I think provoking them is is much less effective than opening up to them and
but you're not
increasing trade,
you're not saying that China
capitalist.
Is so powerful. They've become such a power economically that we really shouldn't ruffle their feathers in any way by talking about human rights.
No, I'm not saying that, but I think that what will determine human rights in China is not U.S. governmental declarations to the Chinese government, but the expansion of both our economies and the increasing globalization of capitalism, which intrinsically requires emancipation of the participants in this free market system around the world.
Charles?
I think it's, respect for human rights is part of our genetics as Americans. I mean, it's what we are Americans, not because we necessarily are from this land necessarily. We're Americans because we subscribe to some basic principles. So I think it's really impossible for us to take the respect for human rights out of the dialogue that we have with China. I agree completely with George, though, that there are two ways of becoming effective in trying to get that message across. One is to be a village preacher, which is not particularly effective with the Chinese, and the other is to show respect for human rights generally and do real human rights. And I think that is an important part of American foreign policy in China, and I think we're going to continue.
Well, thank you all for a fascinating discussion, George, Gordon, and Charles. And thank you for joining us. For Ideas in Action, I'm Jim Glassman. We'll see you next week.
For more information, visit us at ideasinactiontv.com. Funding for Ideas in Action is provided by Investors Business Daily. Every stock market cycle is led by America's never-ending stream of innovative new companies and inventions. Investors Business Daily helps investors find these new leaders as they emerge. More information is available at investors.com. This program is a production of Grace Creek Media and the George W. Bush Institute, which are solely responsible for its content.